In the beginning, America had stronger economic ties with the Allied nations than with the Central nations. America was well in favor of the Allied nations in the earliest stages of war. These economic ties were strong because the United States and her allies had many things in common, culturally, economically, and diplomatically. One of the strongest economic ties America had was with England, because they shared a common ancestry since most of the people came from England themselves. Because of the strong ties with England, the United States secretly supplied English military materials in hope of ending World War I quickly. But because America favored the Allied nations more to tip the balance of power against Germany, it made neutrality simply impossible. The desire to tip the balance of power caused President Wilson to make decisions that intensified America's economic involvement with the Allies. As American economic commitment to the Allies continues to grow, America soon became bound with the Allies in an assured union of war and prosperity, thus contributing to the American involvement in World War I. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare policy began in 1917 when the Germans intensified the submarine warfare shortly after the war began. Because of the British naval blockade, it caused drastic food shortages in Germany. Thus a desperate strike back was made. The decision was that Germany established its own naval blockade around Britain, and by January of 1917, the Germans announced the unrestricted submarine warfare. This policy allowed the Germans to use their submarines to sink any ship without warning in the waters around Britain. But this wasn't the first time the Germans tried this policy. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine sank Lusitania, a British passenger ship. The result of this attack left 1,198 people dead, including 128 United States citizens. This upset the American public greatly. In effect, President Woodrow Wilson took action by sending a strong protest to Germany. This became known as the Sussex Pledge. In order to break U.S. ties with Germany, President Wilson used diplomatic pressure as they were negotiating the terms. One was inviting other neutrals to join and show Germany how world opinion disapproves of his actions. He also wanted to point out the immensity of dangers. His efforts helped Germany realize the stakes with which they were gambling didn't have any effect because Germany refused to give in. Soon after, the unrestricted submarine warfare surfaced again. The Germans were well aware that using this policy might lead to war with the United States, but continued to push their luck. Neglecting the warnings given by President Wilson, the German submarines sank 3 American ships. As a result, this motivated the U.S. closer to the war. The Zimmermann telegram was discovered by the British when they intercepted the message from Germany's Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann. This action Germany took provoked the U.S. and was evidence that Germany had anticipated war. According to the message, Arthur Zimmermann said Germany was willing to assist Mexico in the process of taking back the land controlled by the United States, if and only if Mexico would agree to become allies with Germany. Realizing that the Zimmermann note had gone far past the borders of U.S., President Wilson took action. On April 2, 1917, the Congress gave President Wilson permission to declare war, and finally, the United States entered World War I, fighting alongside the Allies. 6 weeks after the United States was formally entered in war, the Selective Service Act was passed by United States Congress on May 18, 1917. It gave authorization to the federal government to draft a number of men to raise a potentially strong army, in hopes to help the Allies defeat the Central Powers. Men between the ages of 21 and 30 had to register. Shortly after, about 10 million men had registered for the military draft, with 2.8 million actually drafted. The United States also used heavily saturated amounts of propaganda. The U.S. did all they could to give economic assistance. Our supplies and money greatly did the Allies a favor. The American Expedition Force was led by General John Pershing. He led troops to Lafayette Tomb in France first. Troops did not begin to play a major role in the fighting in France until about a year later. By then, Germans had launched a hostile new offensive on the Western Front, but the United States got there just in time to stop them. In late spring 1918, the Allies with America helped succeed in the Second Battle of Marne. Germans wanted to claim territory for the French. However, the French had the United States on their side, which helped the French greatly by setting up fake trenches. Eventually, the Germans' plan backfired on them and faced a dreadful defeat. The United States also helped defeat Germans in the Meuse-Argonne offensive of 1918. The Allied forces had tricked Germans to make them think that they were traveling in the opposite direction they were really going. The United States began to custom in the area between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. They then followed the French to where the Germans were going, and launched a surprise attack on them. The Germans simply couldn't be everywhere at once, and suffered another defeat by the Allies. The Americans helped break the German line in the Western Front, which eventually brought an end to the war. With the entry of the United States into the war, the Germans had fear struck into them. America's entry into the war with an enormous amount of fresh soldiers demoralized both German troops and, even more importantly, high command. The Germans felt the need to make a serious and immense push to either end the war or severely cripple the Allied forces. This map shows the initial deployment of German forces in the Royal Berkshire Regiment in Britain and their offensive tactics. Their strategic thinking was that the arrival of fresh United States soldiers would tilt the balance of war in favor of the Allies, leading them to believe a push was necessary before the full weight of the United States could be incorporated. The German offensive in 1918 resulted in suffering huge casualties to the army of 605,000 German soldiers, which ultimately ended the war. With the reinforcements and support of American troops, the German offensive had utterly failed, leading to the end of World War I, with the Allied forces in victory. Even though the United States had joined late in the war, they still practiced total war. For example, production of metal corsets in America had been halted due to the increased demand for those resources to make military supplies and weapons. This stimulated the United States economy, increasing employment and wages, and increased profit from industry. Clearly, the United States did not take as big of a negative impact from the war, unlike their allies. France, for example, was devastated due to the number of soldiers lost in battle. The United States lost approximately 57,000 soldiers, while on the other hand, France lost 2 million soldiers. In addition, fertile land in northern France was impassive from farming for nearly a decade. After the war, the United States emerged clearly as the greatest power in the world due to their economic rise and political power. By not initially participating in the war effort, the United States essentially allowed themselves to lose the privilege and power that accompanied the former status of the country. Later on, at the end of the war, the United States was able to gain back some respect and power. World War I displayed to the world that the American nation was a strong fighting force, a real-world power, and a potential enemy to those who disturbed the peace. The United States was already considered one of the most influential and powerful industries in the world in the 1890s. They now were known for their incredible powerful military resources and powers in the world. After the United States entered the war, the Allied powers had access to the country's wealth. They used the American resources to keep the German submarines from getting too out of control, and to support their own war efforts. Basically, the United States was a fresh batch of resources that allowed the Allies to win the war.